That night with my son Ethan was by far the most intense yet unforgettable experience of my life. My name is Olivia, and I want to share a story about something that happened between me and my son Ethan. It's not an easy topic to discuss, but it's a secret I've held on to for too long. Ethan is 19 now, but this began a few years ago after my husband David passed away. Losing David was one of the hardest challenges I've ever endured, leaving Ethan and me to navigate life without him. At first, it was incredibly tough. Ethan grew quiet and withdrawn, spending most of his time in his room or out with friends. He avoided any mention of David or his passing, and I didn't want to push him. Instead, I focused on creating a warm, welcoming environment at home. I cooked his favorite meals, left encouraging notes on his desk, and made sure he knew I was there if he ever needed to talk. Still, for months, he remained distant. Then one evening, he walked into the kitchen while I was tidying up after dinner. His sudden appearance startled me, but I was happy to see him. It wasn't often he sought me out like this. "Do you need help, Mom?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. I turned to him, surprised by the offer. "Sure, you can dry the dishes," I replied, handing him a towel. We worked together in silence for a while, and I couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. It was the first time he had willingly spent time with me in what seemed like forever. "How was school today?" I asked, trying to start a conversation. "It was fine," he said, not looking up. That was all. I didn't press him further. "If you ever want to talk, I'm here," I added gently, glancing at him from the corner of my eye. He nodded but didn't say more. Over the next few weeks I noticed small changes. Ethan began spending more time around me, sitting with me in the living room while I watched TV or helping with little tasks around the house. He even started opening up, sharing details about his classes and his college plans. For the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of hope, as if we were slowly finding our way back to normal. But then one evening, something happened that made me question everything. We were having dinner together when Ethan surprised me by cooking that night a simple pasta dish he'd learned from a friend. As we ate, he looked at me and said, "You're amazing, Mom." I chuckled lightly, brushing off the compliment. "Thanks, Ethan. That means a lot," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. But his expression didn't change. He stared at me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice soft but cautious. "Nothing," he said quickly, shaking his head. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." I nodded, unsure how to respond. The moment felt odd, but I told myself I was overthinking it. He was just being kind, wasn't he? The night that changed everything hadn't happened yet, but this was undoubtedly the beginning. After that evening, things started to shift. Ethan began spending more time around me, finding reasons to sit close to me on the couch or linger in the kitchen while I cooked. At first, I thought it was sweet. I told myself he was simply trying to reconnect after all the time we'd spent grieving in our own ways. But then there were the looks. His eyes would linger on me longer than they should, and his compliments became more frequent and personal. "You look really nice today, Mom," he said one morning as I stood at the sink washing dishes. "Thanks, sweetheart," I replied, keeping my tone light. But the way he said it, the way he looked at me, sent a wave of unease through me. One evening, we were sitting on the couch watching a movie. Ethan had picked a comedy we'd seen countless times before. Halfway through, I realized he was sitting closer to me than usual. Our shoulders nearly touched, and when I shifted slightly, he didn't move away. "You're always so busy," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "You never take time for yourself." I smiled, caught off guard. "That's what moms do, Ethan. There's always something to take care of." He shook his head, his gaze locked on me. "You do too much. You deserve a break." His words made my chest tighten. "That's sweet of you to say," I replied, but added quickly, "I'm fine, really." That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment again and again in my mind. Was it just an innocent gesture? Or was I imagining something more? What was happening between us? In the days that followed, I began to notice Ethan finding more and more reasons to be near me. If I was cooking, he'd appear in the kitchen to chat. If I was outside in the garden, he'd wander out and sit with me. His compliments continued, each one unsettling me more than the last, and to my surprise, I realized I was doing the same, seeking him out more often than before. "You make this house feel alive," he said one afternoon while I folded laundry. I froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. "Thank you, Ethan," I said at last, forcing a smile. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, and it wasn't a change I felt comfortable with. The unease in me grew bigger by the day. I tried convincing myself that I was overthinking it, that Ethan was simply being kind, maybe even trying to make up for the emotional distance we'd both felt since David's death. But it wasn't just the compliments. It was how he acted, the way he was always around, watching me, finding excuses to stay close. And as much as I hated to admit it, I hadn't quite figured out why I seemed to be doing the same to him. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. I heard Ethan's footsteps behind me, soft against the tiled floor. I didn't turn around, focusing on the task at hand, hoping he'd just grab a snack and leave. "Do you need help, Mom?" he asked. I glanced over my shoulder and gave him a quick smile. "Sure, you can slice these carrots," I said, sliding the cutting board toward him. He stepped up beside me, his movements deliberate, and started cutting. For a while we worked in silence. I thought it might just be a quiet, pleasant moment, something normal, but then he stopped cutting and turned to look at me. "You've done so much for me," he said, his voice low. I glanced at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, after Dad died. You've taken care of everything. You didn't have to, but you did," he said, his eyes locked on mine. I felt a pang of emotion in my chest. "Of course I did, Ethan. You're my son." "I love you," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. He nodded, but his gaze didn't waver. "I just don't think I ever said thank you for all of it," Ethan said softly. "You don't have to thank me," I replied quickly, turning back to the stove. "That's what moms do." He didn't respond, but I could feel his gaze on me. The moment felt too heavy, too intense, and all I wanted was for it to end. Finally, he picked up the knife and started cutting again, and I let out a small breath of relief. After dinner that night, I settled onto the couch with a book, hoping to lose myself in its pages. Ethan walked into the living room and sat down next to me, not in his usual spot at the other end of the couch, but right beside me. "What are you reading?" he asked, leaning closer to look at the cover. "It's just a novel," I said, holding it up for him to see. "Nothing too exciting." "Can I read it with you?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. Ethan hadn't shown much interest in reading since he was a child, and I couldn't recall the last time we'd done something like this together. Part of me wanted to say no, to tell him I needed some time to myself, but another part of me didn't want to push him away. "Sure," I said, scooting over slightly to give him more space. He leaned in close, his shoulder brushing against mine as I began to read aloud. At first, it felt like any other moment we might have shared years ago, before life became so complicated. But as the minutes ticked by, I became increasingly aware of how close he was, how intently he was watching me. Not the book. When I finished the chapter, I closed the book and set it down. "That's enough for tonight," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Thanks for reading to me," he said, his tone soft. "You're welcome," I replied, standing up and heading toward my bedroom. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Mom," he said. But there was something in his voice, something I couldn't quite place. The next morning when I walked into the kitchen, Ethan was already there. He'd made coffee and set out breakfast, something he hadn't done in years. "Good morning, Mom," he said cheerfully. "I made you some coffee." "Thank you, Ethan," I replied cautiously, sitting down at the table. He sat across from me, watching as I took a sip. "You work so hard," he said suddenly. "You deserve to be taken care of, too." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "That's very sweet of you," I said finally, "but you don't have to do all this for me." "I want to," he said firmly. After breakfast, I retreated to the garden, hoping to clear my head. The air was cool, and the scent of blooming flowers surrounded me. I sat on the bench, staring out at the neatly trimmed hedges, trying to make sense of everything. I wasn't sure how long I'd been sitting there when I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw Ethan walking toward me, his hands in his pockets. "Can I sit with you?" he asked. "Of course," I said, though a part of me wanted to say no. He sat down beside me, leaving a small space between us. For a while, we sat in silence, the only sounds coming from the rustling leaves and the distant songs of birds. "You've been quiet lately," he said finally. "I've just had a lot on my mind," I replied, keeping my gaze fixed on the garden. "Is it about me?" he asked, his tone soft but serious. The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated before answering. Why would you think that? He shrugged. I don't know. I just feel like maybe I've done something to upset you. You haven't upset me, I said quickly. I've just been tired. He nodded but didn't say anything else. After a few more minutes he stood up. I'll leave you alone, he said quietly. I watched him walk back into the house, a knot of guilt forming in my chest. He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? So why did I feel so uneasy? The days that followed felt strange, as though a heavy cloud had settled over the house. I tried to act normal, cooking meals, tidying up, and going about my usual routine, but I couldn't shake the tension I felt whenever Ethan was nearby. He hadn't done anything overtly wrong, but his presence lingered in a way that felt different. And then one night, I made a conscious effort to create some space between us. After dinner, I retreated to my bedroom earlier than usual, craving some quiet time alone. Curling up with a book, I let the soft glow of the bedside lamp envelop me in a cocoon of warmth. For the first time in days, I felt a fleeting sense of peace, a break from the unsettling dynamic that had been forming. Yet, I couldn't ignore the tension and excitement that stirred within me whenever I thought about Ethan. It was the first time I acknowledged those feelings, and the realization hit me hard. I couldn't accept the fact that Ethan was my own son. Just as I started to relax, a soft knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. Mom? Ethan's voice was low, almost hesitant. I paused before answering. Yes? Can I come in? I glanced at the clock. It was late, far past the time Ethan usually went to bed. Is something wrong? I asked, sitting up slightly. I wanted to talk, he said. I sighed, setting my book aside. Come in. The door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside. He looked different. Less like the confident young man he usually was, and more like the boy I used to comfort after nightmares when he was little. He lingered in the doorway for a moment, as though unsure whether to come closer. What's on your mind? I asked, patting the edge of the bed. He sat down, his movements slow and deliberate. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes fixed on the floor. Then he looked up, his gaze locking with mine. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, he said finally. For what? I asked, my voice cautious. For making you feel uncomfortable, he said, his tone sincere. I know I've been acting different lately, and I don't want you to think I'm trying to make things weird between us. I blinked, surprised by his honesty. Ethan, I started, but he cut me off. I've been feeling a lot of things, and I don't really know how to deal with them, he said, his voice cracking slightly. But I don't want to hurt you. His words hung in the air, heavy with a meaning I couldn't fully grasp. Reaching out, I placed a hand on his shoulder. Ethan, it's okay to feel confused sometimes, I said gently. But you need to remember that I'm your mom, and our relationship has boundaries. He nodded, his gaze dropping back to the floor. His eyes glistened with unshed tears. I know. I'm sorry, Ethan said again, his voice barely above a whisper. I gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before pulling my hand away. Let's not worry about it anymore, I said, trying to keep my tone light. We'll figure it out together. There was a certain tension and excitement in the air between us, something I couldn't quite name. The look in his eyes told me there was more to come, and to my surprise, I found myself giving him the same look in return. He nodded once more, then stood up. Good night, Mom, he said softly before leaving the room. I watched him go, a strange mix of relief and sadness settling over me. He had acknowledged the tension between us, which felt like a step in the right direction. But I couldn't help wondering if things could ever truly go back to normal. One thing I knew for sure, this wasn't the last time something like this would happen. And I was right, undeniably right, because the next time it happened, things would end very differently. The following morning, I woke up feeling more drained than usual. The conversation with Ethan had kept me awake for hours, my mind racing with what-ifs and unanswered questions. I went through my morning routine, trying to shake off the lingering unease. Ethan seemed different that day, quieter, more reserved. He kept to himself, spending most of the day in his room. Part of me wanted to check on him, to make sure he was okay, but another part of me felt it was best to give him space. That evening, as I sat in the living room folding laundry, Ethan walked in. He sat down on the couch without saying a word, watching me silently as I worked. The quiet between us felt heavy, and I struggled to think of something to break it. "You've been quiet today," I said finally, glancing at him. He shrugged. "Just thinking." "About anything in particular?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "About us," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, the weight of his words sinking in. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. He hesitated, his eyes meeting mine. "I mean, I know things have been weird lately, and I don't want it to be like that anymore," he said. I nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. "I don't want that either," I said finally. "But we need to figure out how to move forward." He nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. "We will." For a brief moment I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things would get better. Maybe we could move past this and find a way to rebuild our relationship. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something I didn't fully understand. Or maybe I did understand it, but I wasn't ready to accept it. The quiet unease that had settled over the house didn't go away. Ethan tried to act normal, but I could see the struggle in his eyes, the way he hesitated before speaking or lingered too long when we crossed paths. I wanted to believe his apology marked the end of everything, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Then one evening, as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone in an attempt to unwind, it happened again. The house was silent, save for the soft creak of the ceiling fan above me. I had just begun to drift off when I heard a faint knock at my bedroom door. "Mom?" Ethan's voice was soft, almost hesitant. I sat up, my heart sinking. "Yes? Can I come in?" he asked. I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. "Ethan, it's late," I said, trying to keep my tone firm. "What's wrong?" There was a pause before he replied. I just need to talk to you." Something in his voice made me hesitate. I took a deep breath before saying, "Okay, come in." The door creaked open, and Ethan stepped inside. He looked unsure of himself, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as he lingered near the doorway. "What is it, Ethan?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated, his gaze flickering between me and the floor. "I've been thinking a lot about what I said the other night," Ethan began, his voice low. I feel like I need to be honest with you." My chest tightened. "Honest about what?" I asked carefully. He stepped closer, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "About how I feel," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I know it's wrong, and I've tried to ignore it. But I can't stop thinking about you, Mom." My breath caught in my throat. I stared at him, my mind racing. "Ethan, you can't," I began, but he cut me off. "I know," he said quickly, his voice full of desperation. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. You've been everything to me since Dad died. You're kind and strong, and you've done so much for me. I don't know how to stop feeling this way." His words hit me like a physical blow. I felt frozen, unable to move or speak as his confession hung heavily in the air. "Ethan, you're my son," I said finally, my voice shaking. "I love you, but not like that. This has to stop." "I know," he whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. I needed to tell you." I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Ethan, what you're feeling is a result of everything we've been through. It's not real. You're young and you're confused, but this isn't right. We need to work through this together." He nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "I know," I replied, my heart breaking at the sight of him. "But we can't let this continue. You're a good person, Ethan, and you'll move past this." He wiped his eyes, standing up slowly. "Good night, Mom," he said, his voice barely audible. "Good night," I replied, watching as he left the room and closed the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, I locked the door and sat back down on the bed, my hands trembling. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I felt overwhelmed with guilt and confusion, questioning everything I had done that might have led to this moment. I loved Ethan with all my heart, but his feelings were something I couldn't ignore or dismiss. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying his words in my head, trying to make sense of them. I told myself it was just a phase, a moment of confusion that would pass. But deep down, I wasn't sure. The next morning, Ethan was quiet the next morning. He barely said a word at breakfast, and when he left for school, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I spent the day trying to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting back to our conversation. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. When Ethan came home that evening, he seemed distant, avoiding eye contact and retreating to his room almost immediately. I wanted to talk to him, to make sure he was okay, but I didn't know where to start. I felt trapped, unsure of how to handle the situation without making things worse. Later that night, I was sitting in the living room, staring at the TV without really watching it. The house was quiet, and the weight of everything pressed down on me. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw Ethan standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Can I sit with you?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course." He walked over and sat down on the couch, leaving a small space between us. For a while, we sat in silence, the tension between us almost unbearable. "Mom," he said finally, his voice soft, "I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I said quickly. "But we need to set boundaries, Ethan, for both of us." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I understand." I reached out, placing a hand on his knee. "We'll get through this," I said gently, "but you have to trust me." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with emotion. "I do," he said. I gave him a small smile, hoping to reassure him. "Then we'll be okay." As I sat there, I felt a glimmer of hope that we could move past this, but deep down, I knew it would take time. The days after our conversation were tense but quiet. Ethan kept his distance, and I tried to act as though everything was normal. Yet the truth weighed heavily on me. I hoped that acknowledging the situation and setting boundaries would help us both move forward. Still, something deep inside told me that the silence between us wasn't enough to fix what had been broken. Then, one final night, I went to bed early, exhausted from a day spent trying to keep my thoughts from spiraling. The house was silent, and the cool night air drifted softly through my open window. I tried to let the rhythmic hum of the fan lull me to sleep, but my mind wouldn't quiet. At some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was pulled from sleep by the sound of my door creaking open. My heart jumped as I blinked into the darkness, trying to orient myself. "Mom?" Ethan's voice was barely a whisper but unmistakable. I sat up, reaching for the bedside lamp. The warm glow filled the room, illuminating Ethan standing hesitantly in the doorway. His hands fidgeted nervously at his sides, and he looked unsure of himself. "Ethan?" I said, my voice thick with sleep and confusion. "What are you doing?" He stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. "I couldn't sleep," he said quietly. I needed to see you." My chest tightened as I worked to steady my breathing. "It's late," I said, my voice firmer now. "You need to go back to bed." "I know," he said, his eyes locking onto mine, but I couldn't stop thinking about everything. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, sitting upright. "Ethan, I was thinking about you too," I said gently. "But we talked about this. I love you, but it's not something we can discuss anymore." He took another step forward, his expression a mix of determination and vulnerability. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help how I feel," he said, his voice trembling. "You're the only one who's ever really been there for me. You've always cared about me in a way no one else has." My throat tightened as I searched for the right words. "Ethan, I care about you because I'm your mom," I said firmly. "That's my job, but the way you're feeling, it's not healthy. It's not right." He stood there for a moment, his shoulders slumping as the weight of my words settled over him. "I'm sorry," he said softly, tears glistening in his eyes. "I just didn't know how else to tell you." My heart broke at the sight of him, but I forced myself to remain composed. "It's okay to feel confused, Ethan," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But this is something you need to work through, and I'll help you as your mom, but only as your mom." The words felt hollow as I spoke them, conflicted by emotions I couldn't fully admit even to myself. I saw the disappointment in his eyes, and it made me regret my choice. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't want to lose you," Ethan said, his voice barely audible. "You won't," I assured him, But we have to move forward, Ethan, for both of us. As I said those words, something inside me shifted. Suddenly I found myself questioning everything. What am I doing? Why can't I just help my son with what he needs? He's my son. Seeing the disappointment in his eyes hurt more than I could bear, and I realized I didn't want to push him away anymore. Deep down, I couldn't deny that I liked the idea of what he wanted, perhaps because I missed David so much. Or maybe for reasons I wasn't ready to admit. After a moment of silence, I said softly, "You know what? Come here, honey." He hesitated, then moved toward me, his expression a mixture of relief and hope. As he sat beside me, I could see him starting to open up again. "Look me in the eyes," I said gently, leaning toward him. He leaned toward me as well, and then it happened. We kissed. It felt like a bomb of tension had exploded, releasing everything we had been holding back. The kiss was electric, so intense that I instinctively deepened it, pulling him closer. After a minute or two, he pulled back, not out of hesitation, but because his hands began to wander, touching me in ways only David had before. And as you can probably guess, we didn't stop there. We went further, and I finally understood why I'd called this the craziest yet most exciting night of my life. It was everything I hadn't realized I craved. When it was over, there was a long, heavy silence between us. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, his voice tender. "Yes, honey," I replied, my voice soft but steady. For what felt like 10 or 20 minutes, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the fan. Then, Ethan stood and walked toward the door. He paused in the doorway, glancing back at me. "Good night, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Good night, Ethan," I replied, my heart aching as I watched him leave. "Thank you for everything." "I have to thank you, Mom," he added before the door clicked shut behind him. I let out a shaky breath, the tension in my chest finally easing. Lying back down, I stared at the ceiling as the events of the past few weeks played out in my mind. I knew we still had a long road ahead, but for the first time I felt a sliver of hope. The tension had snapped, and perhaps now we could find some semblance of clarity. The next morning, Ethan was quiet, but composed. Ethan joined me for breakfast, and while the conversation was light, I sensed a noticeable shift in his demeanor. He seemed more at ease, as if he had finally let go of some of the emotional weight he'd been carrying. Over the next few weeks, things began to feel more normal. Ethan started spending more time with friends, refocusing on school and his plans for the future. We didn't talk about what had happened again, but the unspoken understanding between us was clear. We were both trying to move forward. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ethan turned to me and said, "Thanks for being patient with me, Mom. Thank you for everything you do for me, and with me. Thanks for accepting me for who I am, and helping me in ways that moms usually don't help their sons." I looked at him, surprised, but deeply touched by his words. Placing my hand gently on his arm, I replied, "Of course, that's what moms do." He smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it seemed genuine. In that moment, I felt a sense of reassurance, as though we were going to be okay. Still, I'm not entirely sure about what I've done or the choices I've made. Since it first happened, it has happened a few more times, and I can't deny that I've come to enjoy it as well. Maybe it's because we're both trying to fill the void left by losing David, or maybe it's something else entirely I honestly don't know. I needed to share this story with someone, to hear what others think. Should I stop this with Ethan? Or could it be more normal than I realize? Please share your thoughts in the comments. It would mean a lot to me. Thank you.